Welcome everyone to the fourth and last lecture in the Euro-Arab Conversation lecture series. As always, the lecture will be followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A channel below. And tonight, our guest speaker is Dr. Amer Bisat, who is joining us all the way from the US to unpack the political aspect of the economic relations between the EU and the Arab states. So to give an introduction, Dr. Amer Bisat is a managing director and the head of sovereign and emerging markets investments at the American multinational investment management corporation, BlackRock, where he leads a team managing approximately $20 billion in governments and corporate bonds. And prior to BlackRock, he was a partner in two macro hedge funds, Traxis and Rubicon, and held portfolio management responsibilities at UBS and Morgan Stanley Investment Management. And between 1991 and 1998, he was a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund, at the IMF, where he helped negotiate high-profile programs with Russia, Ukraine, and Egypt. Dr. Bisat also has taught graduate-level economics courses at Columbia University. And yes, so I'm very excited to have you here this evening to talk about this really interesting subject. So welcome, Dr. Bisat, and thank you for your time. And I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Sharel. It's a pleasure to be with you and with your colleagues. As I was telling you before we started, I was supposed to be in Amsterdam today of all the places. Unfortunately, ended up canceled, so I'm now in New York. But I was going to be very close to you, at least geographically. Listen, the question that you asked me is, Sharel, when we were talking a few months ago, was to look at this whole very complicated relationship between Europe and particularly the Arab world. And I'm going to, by the way, interchangeably move between Arab world and MENA, back and forth as I talk, right? And listen, that relationship is intuitive, right? I mean, there's enormous amounts of the decidedly common cultural relationships that are centuries in the making. There's obviously the geographic connections that are quite powerful, also historic in nature, and there's also the economic connections that are quite powerful. So it stood to reason that at some point in the last few decades, especially since the post-colonial era, after the end of the Second World War, it was only normal for Europe to try to deepen that relationship and try to force it into something much more profound. And that started as early as 1961, became more systematic in 1972. In 1995, they did this thing called the Barcelona Declaration, which was meant to be the first formal relationship between the Arab world and Europe. Eventually, they expanded it to something more profound called the European Neighborhood Policy in 2004, right? And that's the topic that I'm going to be discussing, hopefully the next half an hour, 35 minutes, and then I'd love to have a conversation with you, right? The topic itself can be tackled purely from an economic, technocratic angle, which I will, by the way. I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about the economics of it. However, at its core, it's also a topic that has deep political implications and a deep political angles to it. So I'm going to do 6 things, right? I'm going to start with a empirical read of that relationship, more of a factual one. I'm going to move on to say that the reason I'm going to make the argument that relationship has been significantly disappointing and much worse than what we had hoped for when the process started. I'm going to move on to talk about that the challenge of Arab-European integration cannot be divorced from the failure of the economic model in the Arab region itself. So I'm going to focus on the Arab region itself. Then I'll move on to say that, yes, that's true, but there's also a third angle, which is that the shortcomings are in the architecture and the design of that integration effort. I will veer a little bit and talk about ideology and talk about Europe's ideological approach to the region, and will suggest that's part of the reasons why that integrative effort has been disappointing. I'll take a bit of a detour and touch upon a broader geopolitical aspects of the Arab-European relations. Here, talk about Iran, talk about the US, and finally conclude with more of a normative, forward-looking agenda. If we were to reimagine that relationship, I'm going to make the argument this has been disappointing. How would it look like? What's the ideal here, right? So let me start off with the first point, which is the factual one, the empirical one, right? The starting point, obviously, is that with hindsight, is there was a huge difference between what the original designers of the integration effort hoped for and what we're actually seeing right now, right? The integrations effort was always political in nature at its core, right? At its core, it's two regions that are very close to each other, that have things in common with each other, whose interests are interlinked, wanted to get together, but wanted to do it through economics, right? And the objective was always to increase growth in the Middle East, in the Arab world, through deeper economic integrations, including through exports, including through integration of the labor and the capital markets, right? That was always the objective. The ultimate objective was one of convergence, was one of making people in the South look more like people in the North, try to create a convergence of economics and of standard of living, right? Unfortunately, by the metrics of economics, that integration has proved to be quite disappointing, right? If you look at the one simple metric, the per capita GDP of the Arab world, of the various countries in the Arab world, compared to Europe, right? When we started the effort back in the, I'm using the Barcelona Declaration '94 as the starting point, right? Most of the countries were anywhere, their per capita GDP was anywhere between 10 and 50% of the Europe's GDP, average GDP, right? Where are they today? Between 10 and 50%. Nothing has changed. We still have, if anything, when you look at these charts, they are slightly, very gradually, you have to squint, but you can see them declining, as in we're not only not catching up, we're probably losing ground as well. If anything, if exports was the reason through which the convergence was going to occur, there's absolutely no sign whatsoever that the region was able to increase its exports to Europe. If anything, we're importing more from Europe, we being the Arab world, more, and exporting less to Europe than we did when the early 1990s, right? The region failed miserably in growing the export base, right? Which is strange, given that the presence of cheap, skilled labor in the Arab world, cheap capital, cheap and available energy, proximity to large markets. You would have expected that the Arab world would have built up a much bigger export base. We did not at all. If you focus on manufacturing itself, the Arab world sort of accounts for roughly 4% of the global economy. We're less than 1% of the total exports of global exports, right? So we punch well below our weight. And if you take out, now, by the way, and these numbers include Turkey and Israel, by the way, which are not Arabs, obviously. But if you take them out, the number is even much lower than that. Here I'm talking about non-energy exports, by the way. I'm just talking about traditional manufacturing exports. If you dig deeper into the quality of exports into the region, right, into Europe, from the Middle East to Europe, if anything, and here we are metrics of depth, sophistication, value add that goes into the exports that you do. If anything, they've always been low. The region never exported high value added exports. And if anything, the complexity and the diversification, the complexity of the production base has been, like, by metrics of the World Bank, has, if anything, been declining and deteriorating rather than expanding, right? The region failed in building assembly activities, right, that go beyond simply using cheap labor. That's what we're good at. We use cheap labor, it's typically in textiles, right? We've never been able to incorporate technology in a profound way, or intellectual property into our production chains as well. Finally, the region punches it's well below its weight in services, which is a bit surprising, right? Given the high skill set of some of the Middle East countries. I'm thinking Lebanon, I'm thinking Syria, I'm thinking Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia. You'd think that we would be good in services. We're not. I mean, tourism sort of ranks up there, shows up as a service, but and obviously with the loss of Lebanon right now, even that has been significant, right? Which makes sense, by the way, because services are notoriously hampered by regulatory factors, which I'm going to go back and talk about quite a bit in a second, right? So they've been hampered by regulations and by monopolies and by oligarchy. So what we're supposed to be good at, we never were able to export, right? FDI is a bright spot, right? The region did attract $1 trillion since the early 1990s in FDI. So on the face of it, and quite a bit of it was roughly half from the GCC, half came from Europe, very little from elsewhere. So you'd think that FDI was actually a bright spot in that globalization trend. Unfortunately, that's not true, because when you dig deep into it, you see that most of the foreign direct investment into the region really went into what we call non-tradables, right? Things like construction, mining, right? There's another metric which I found absolutely fascinating. We got $1 trillion and in FDI in the last 20 years, and we created 1 million jobs out of them, right? So each job cost $1 million to generate. And so that FDI really never went into the labor-intensive industries the way we want, right? Now, what about capital flows? What about financial integration between the Arab world and the Middle East? Outside between the Arab world and Europe, I apologize. Outside FDI, and once you start digging deeper into what kind of financial flows between the Arab world and Europe in particular, you realize that outside FDI, which I was saying went into construction and mining, not into manufacturing, most of it was external official assistance, right? It was more humanitarian. And it sort of spikes during periods of war. So it's not your, and insofar as there is private sector flows, they tend to be very much portfolio flows, short-term funding, what I call hot money. Egypt is a great example of how much money went into there, where it's all 3 months T-bills that the minute there's something wrong, they very quickly leave, right? Another area where there is some success of the integration is clearly the labor market. Clearly, there's enormous amounts of young men who moved from the region, particularly to Europe, right? And some would say that alone that's enough, right? The remittances that we attract that get flown back are a significant support of the balance of payments of the Arab country. However, there are good studies from the World Bank, that says that the cost of the brain drain, the cost of the loss of skill set that left the Arab world to Europe was higher than the benefits that you bring from remittances. More so because as the people who leave become more and more educated, right, they start sending less and less money. They become more and more integrated in the host country. And as a result, you don't get the benefit. Finally, and this is my last point on how the promise of integration was much less than we actually saw. It's more structural, right? We had so many trade agreements, so many association agreements. However, when you do, and formal tariffs between the regions did go down. So it's true the tariffs have come down. However, when you look at non-tariff barriers and other regulatory restrictions between the regions, and you try to measure them properly, we saw that those rose at a pace that is faster than the trade tariffs that went down, right? So, and in the meantime, there is significant empirical work that I will be getting back into that says that those barriers that I talked about, non-trade barriers, sort of contributed to the rise of what we call crony capitalism in the region, and rent seeking and rentier type of activity, right? So structurally, that integration also, even though on the face of it, we legally became more open and more integrated. When you look at it deeply in terms of non-tariff barriers, restrictions of what it means for capitalism in those countries themselves, you very quickly realize that those negatives are much bigger than the positives, right? So empirically, factually, the promise of integration has been at best disappointing and at worst a disaster. Right. So now let's sort of dig a little bit deeper into why this happened, which is my second topic, which is, okay, that failure, that disappointment really cannot be divorced from the failure of the economic development model in the Arab world itself. So this is not, I don't want to throw the blame only on Europe, which I will, by the way, quite a bit in a second. But I'm going to say that part of we the Arabs actually take a significant part of the blame, right? Of the blame. And that's because our own economic development model has been faulty, right? As we say, growth has been very low, right? We've never been able to punch above our weight. There's been very little convergence between us and the rest of the world in the way that the Asians, the Latins did. We just got stuck while they were improving. Right? There are multiple reasons for that, or at least at the very, very top-down level, right? Arab world consumes more than it invests. Right? The Arab world borrows instead of saves. And the Arab world does not pay enough attention and emphasis on productivity and efficiency. Right? So from a solo type model, the total factor productivity argument, we don't invest in capital, and the capital we do invest in is very inefficient. Right? And our emphasis is on labor, but the good labor ends up leading us, right? So what does that mean in a slightly more concrete way, right? Most of the Arab countries run still at a very macro level here. I'm talking macro, not micro yet. At the macro level, most of the countries run very large fiscal deficits, right? And as a result, they're continuously accumulating debt, leading to the kinds of boom-bust scenarios that we see so often in North Africa, in Egypt. Obviously, the big one right now is in Lebanon, right? Within that fiscal deficit, there's, and I'm not going to go spend any time on this one, but trust me on this one, there's enormous inefficient taxation. So the tax system is problematic and spending is very wasteful. So not only are we running deficits, the nature of what we spend the money on as governments is problematic. Competitiveness is partly a macro concept, right? There's this obsession with fixed exchange rates in the Arab region. And the fixity of the exchange rate has led to overvaluation of the currency. And you look at the competitiveness of the region and you see it deteriorating over time as the currency become more and more overvalued. So the pattern of borrowing a lot, not saving, not investing, not growing, with currencies that are overvalued, so loss of competitiveness, tends to lead to these kind of boom-bust scenarios that are never good for integration and globalization. That's on the macro side for why the Arab itself take part of the blame. But there are structural issues as well, right? I'm going to be talking quite a bit about this over and over in this presentation, right? Which is that anti-competition laws, the failure of a judicial system that allows for good intermediation, cronyism. I mean, the best term that I love to use always is that in the Arab world, the private sector needs to be privatized. The private sector lives on the largesse of the state, right? It's a very protective of vested interests, right? So they hate foreign competition. They hate the private sector. There is this emphasis on inefficient state-owned enterprises that are used as ATM machines to hire people in there, right? There's also the political economic angle, right? Why aren't we competitive? We're not competitive because the Arab world has been hampered by, how should I put it, by regimes that were completely focused on power preservation. The regimes in there never felt comfortable allowing the emergence of a flexible, dynamic, entrepreneurial private sector. They were much more focused on power preservation, ended up supporting, helping, funding crony capitalism of the kind that they can control, both so that they can preserve their own power base, but also to enrich themselves. It becomes also a venue for the corruption that we're seeing. So the fragile autocrats were very myopic, and they were fighting integration and reform because they were scared of the entrepreneurial private sector. So, right. So this is my second point here, is that the disappointment in integration, which I think is factual by now, it reflects a failure of the economic development model of the Arab world, right? Well, the reality is, and this brings me to my third point, that's not the only problem, right? I mean, the whole architecture of the integration effort, starting from the Barcelona, and here now I'm shifting the blame onto Europe away from the Arab world itself, right? The failure of the shortcoming, it's partly because the architecture, the design of the effort has been faulty, right? I don't want to just blame the Arab world themselves. With hindsight, it's the architectural design that was part of the problem, right? On the face of it, if you guys look at it, the formal trade connection between the MENA, the Arab world, and Europe is actually quite strong on the face of it, right? Like de jure, not de facto. Every state, almost every state, has signed the trade liberalization agreement with Europe. Many of the countries, especially in North Africa, have what we call association agreements, which are deeper in nature. Having said that, with hindsight, it's now clear that the EuroMed agreements were simply not favorable to the MENA. So yes, they were signed, but they were never really favorable to the Arab world, right? On the one hand, the authoritarian regimes rushed to sign them and accepted very unfavorable terms because it became a way in which they ingratiate themselves with the West, right? We'll get back to that in a second. That marriage between the authoritarian, autocratic regimes and the West really was both ways. The Arab regimes wanted to sleep with the Europeans, and the Europeans were perfectly happy dealing only with them, right? So for reasons that I will get later on, Europe itself chose the path of political expediency and was much more interested in working with the rent-seeking regimes than to target true transformation. So there was expediency on both sides to do something quick and dirty and not complete and not right. Few points to make that argument for why the design itself was structurally. Most importantly, the agreements were signed bilaterally. Right, so we never had a multilateral, let's sit down with all the Arabs and come up with one agreement. It was bilateral, country by country. So they picked on them. Right? It was very easy to go after the weak ones, right? So the countries were in a weak position. For example, most agreements did not include agricultural, the agriculture. Agriculture was excluded from them, and which is ridiculous given how powerful the Southern Mediterranean is in terms of agricultural comparative advantage. Trades in services was also excluded. Again, very surprising given that this is where the comparative advantage of the region is, right? The focus was never or very rarely on human capital and on education, right? It was much more technocratic, very much about trade in goods, right? There was never an attempt at deepening the production chains, prioritizing value-added production, quality control, right? And most importantly, there was never money or transfers. Right? You signed the agreement, but you never supported it. And I'm going to get back to that later on with funding that helped the convergence and helped the transformation that was needed to do the kind of integration that we all look at. So one thing here is that the agreements themselves were faulty and weak, right? The second issue, another issue for why the design was problematic is that this relationship suffered, and here it's a bit technical, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but these agreements suffered greatly from what we call the Happenspoke problem, right? Which is that you dealt with separate countries, not with a regional entity, right? And this reflected fragmented interregional Arab markets. Right? Dealing with people one-on-one, with the spokes, you never dealt with the hub, with the center, with the middle, right? This is an issue of sequencing, as I was saying. Regional integration is a crucial first step often towards global integration. This is what the thing that the trade theory tells you. That's how you avoid the hub and spoke biases, right? Now, the region belatedly in 97 and eventually in 04 tried to fix that problem by creating the so-called Greater Arab Free Trade Area, the GAFTA. That was 1997, got improved later on, right? That has been very limited and very modest, right? Intra-regional trade within the Arab world remains minimal, actually, almost non-existent, right? And this reflected, among other things like local content rules. You can't get free trade unless most of the production is done internally. So, which is right. So that's an issue. The other one was huge negative lists, right? Each country, each government, each autocratic government negotiates these very large negative lists. Say we exempt those lists from low tariffs. These lists have very high tariffs, right? And this is a way in which the autocratic regimes sort of reflected the protectionist tendencies and the ability and their willingness to help their vested interests and their rentier and their what do you call it? The protégés, the balance-seeking people, right? Another reason why the design problem failed is luck, right? Because when the Barcelona Agreement was started, that was was around the time of the Soviet Union falling and East Europe being integrated, right? The problem is that very quickly European Mediterranean Initiative became superseded aggressively by European enlargement and the emphasis and the focus that Europe was putting on East Europe, right? The East European agreements were much more profound, much more deep than the ones that Europe had with the Arab world, right? The superficiality of the MENA agreements compared to those with the East is a huge shortfall, right? So we got superseded by another group of countries that had similar characteristics of convergence, right? Cheap labor, high skill, proximity, all the things that we thought the Arabs were good offered. Now we have somebody, and they're Christians. We're not, right? So it was relatively easy to deal with them in the way the Arab world wasn't, right? Another agricultural design issue was on labor mobility, right? The amount of labor mobility between the regions, between the Arab world and Europe indeed went up. However, the emphasis was always on low-skilled labor. It was never on high-skilled labor, right? And I'll talk about that when I get back to the conclusions and the recommendations later on. So while we did integrate, the integration was a very low quality integration. Finally, and this is not really a failure, this is just a factual point, which is that historically, if you look at other forms of global integration between regional integration, you tended to need a locomotive. One of the players had to be growing very aggressively, right? So Japan with North Asia in the 80s, China with the rest of Asia right now, the US and Latin America, Germany, not Europe, Germany and East Europe, one of the players was always not just rich, but growing fast. The reality is most of our integration are with European countries that were not growing that fast, right? France, Italy, Spain, to some extent the UK, right? So we never hitched our wagon to Germany, right? Which is the one that actually was growing, and this, by the way, itself reflects a little bit of the problems within Europe. Like Europe is not one Europe. Europe is multiple Europes, and we've always either dealt with the center, Brussels, or we dealt with the southern Europeans, who happen to be not the ones who grew at all, right? So the point I was making here is that there is architectural, there are design issues for why this was a disappointment as well. But here I want to veer into, this is my fourth point, into ideology. That these failures of the architecture reflected not just technical, I'm going to use the word incompetence, or technical issues and technocratic issues that are important, but they also reflected, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial if you allow me, ideological problems, right, in which Europe approached the effort. All right, the view that Europe uses to look at the southern Mediterranean is still very much a residual of the colonial period, and we never transcended into one of trading as equals, right? The region was never seen as an equal partner. It was a construction. It was an invention of Europe. At worst, the region was seen as an inferior other, right? The conception of the region started with, they can't govern themselves. We're here to come and tell them what to do and how to run things. That conception was not one of an equal development, right? The Middle East often existed politically only in relation to its instrumental value for Europe itself. And it was never about Europe itself. It was about what the region meant for Europe, right? The way here is that it's appropriated in accordance with the European security interests themselves, right? Over time, this morphed into Europe looking at the region through security, through issues of security, like things that really they care about, right? Terrorism, immigration, fears of weapons of mass destruction, organized crime, right? And that, by the way, explained why Europe tended to deal with the regimes, right, as opposed to the private sector, as opposed to it became easier for them to deal directly with autocratic regimes and security establishments of the countries themselves, right? There was also a bit of especially this happened after the Arab Spring, right, where what was happening in the region suddenly became about what's happening in Europe itself. So the fear of immigration, and this sort of explains also this fear of the youth, right? You don't like the young, you don't want them, you want, right? You think of the youth as dangerous, right? Immigration is no longer seen as an opportunity, right? As one that benefits both. Immigration suddenly becomes a source of danger, a source of instability. You look at it very differently than if you want to look at it, right? And I think that, again, as I was saying, I mean, I'm repeating a point here, is that this sort of explains that the official engagement between Europe and the Arab world, it really is very much a relationship with autocratic regimes. I mean, let me open a parenthesis. I'm Lebanese. And you could see it, right, with the way the Macron initiative, when they were trying to deal with the crisis. I mean, at the end of the day, there was 3 minutes in which he wanted to talk to the civil society, and he tipped his hat to the forces of change. But at the end of the day, he decided, I should talk to the establishment. I should talk to the ancien regime. They're the ones who I know how to. It's more expedient, more quick. And you could see it in a multiple different way. So the fourth point I wanted to make here is that that it's not just about a technocratic limitations, it's also about an ideological approach to the region that also needs to be rethought, and I'll get back to that in a second. Here, I was going to take a detour, and it's not really, Sharel, what you asked me about, but I think it's very important. You need to put the the European-Arab relations in a broader geopolitical context, right? At the end of the day, Europe is not the only geopolitical player in the Middle East. In fact, you could argue it's at best one of many, and you could argue at worst it's the junior to the US, right? You also have the rise of new challenges, geopolitical challenges that define the integration. Here I'm thinking of Iran, I'm thinking of things I'll talk about in a second, the environment, right? So I want to take a bit of a detour here before I conclude, right? The US and Europe have always had a very interesting relationship when it gets to the Middle East. The US essentially inherited the European architecture, right? And it was like they initially, like, this was from the colonial period, right? It was all about lavish military and economic support to pro-Western authoritarian regime. There was this panic about liberation movements, panic about forces of change. It was often seen through the prism of the Cold War. There was also, as I was saying, distrust of the revolutionary movements that were seen as, even if they were there to help the region, they were seen as hurting us. So stay away from them, right? During that period, there was a bit of a division of labor. Right? The U.S. focused on hard security. Europe was the nicer person who was trying to deal with things more softly, including areas like economics, trade relations, as we talked about, governance, right? But the reality is Europe always maintained a broader strategic angle than one that is predominantly focused on the Cold War. They focused on economic, commercial interests. And this, by the way, this focus on commercial interests in the way that US never did, or at least not never, less, right? Motivated the point that I keep on going back over and over again, that your partner in the integration effort is not the private sector, is not the entrepreneurs, it's not the civil society, it's not the young, it's the regimes, right? This commercial interest suddenly becomes about dealing. So you become a player in the rent-seeking effort, the way, unfortunately, a lot of vested interests internally are, right? By the way, and here, like, one has to say, like, at some point things changed, right? It's so the unipolar moment, the early 1990s, there was a complete linkage between what Europe wanted and what the US wanted. They were all rowing in the same boat. Since then, things have changed, right? And there are three things that I think have led to a more of a big diversion, right? It's no longer just, at this point, migration and the threat of refugees and the fear that I talked about, radical Islam, ISIS, and the fear of terrorism, and the importance of obviously Iran as a major regional player in the region as well. And that has also led to a change in the way the Europe looks at the region, right? The approach here, EU's approach to Iran, for example, let's take Iran as a good example of that, has been diametrically opposed to how the US looks at it, right? Europe always aimed to replace the US policy of exclusion and containment with one of engagement, integration, dealing with it. Obama's willingness to adopt that approach was a short-lived exception among a broader desire by the US to exclude, contain Iran, backed by Israel and some of the GCC, of course. So there is this diametric, and the withdrawal of Trump from the JCPOA and Biden's inability to sign it again has created this complete rupture at this point in a way. So the point I'm making here is that this transatlantic drift has been exacerbated by a series of events, not least of which are wars, the incomplete integrations that we talked about, Europe's own ideological stance toward the Middle East. All of these reasons together, the fact that you don't have a partner with the US, the fact that you have new regional powers, the fact that you have now regional challenges that are no longer just about growth, it's now about mass destruction. terrorism, radical Islam, immigration, Iran, is part of the reason why the early 1990s hope for a seamless integration has become more and more complicated. So the point I'm making, not very articulately, but the geopolitical backdrop and the complexity of it, especially after that transatlantic drift between the US and Europe vis-a-vis the Middle East, has made the integration that much harder, right? So here, let me conclude with some forward-looking agenda of integration. And if we want to be normative, if we want to be, what is the ideal here? As I was saying, the lack of the success in building a truly regional integration between Europe and the Arab world is development with has a huge strategic, economic, political implications, right? We're at the moment right now where I personally think, this is my own view, we need a complete rethinking, a complete renegotiation of that relationship almost from scratch, right? The conceptual starting point here is that the way the two partners look at that integration effort is very different, right? The EU has never been able to exit the traditional paradigm, right? Which is very self-interested, very self-referential, which ends up focusing either on technocratic arguments, which are faulty, or by dealing with the regimes that will fight the integration. The Arab people, on the other hand, not the regimes, but the people, and there are enough surveys out there on this that shows this, want something different. They want social, economic justice, and they see that as a prerequisite of political transformation. So they want a tripod, they want a triangle of social progress, economic progress, and political transformation. So we come to it from a very different, so the effort here, the philosophical point here is that the effort has to be a co-development effort, right? Not the North helping the South. Both need to be working together, right? The ultimate objective is to make the relationship look like West Europe's relationship with East Europe. That should be the model, right? The design, there are structural issues, there's technocratic issues that need to be worked on, but there's also political issues that need to be worked on, right? In an ideal world, the design has to be changed. It requires significant enhancements. You need to encourage domestic reforms, including truly requiring the deepening of intra-regional trade, right? You need to move away from pure trade liberalization and deal with the microstructural reforms, non-trade barriers, rule of origin, competitiveness, lowering of barriers. The region is still going through massive demographic boom, by the way. So there's a huge entry into the labor force. So, and this is the third dream here, is that any integration effort should require a human capital improvement should become a priority, right? You need a broader strategic vision for education, right? And how education is structured in the new world. Number 4 is you need to focus on the region has 3 crises, but 3 opportunities, right? Energy, food, and water. Each of them is a crisis in and of itself, right? The energy is a crisis, food is a crisis, water is a crisis, but they could all be opportunities, right? I mean, just think about the energy availabilities in the region, the water availability in the region, right? If we can deal with them in a more and focus on them sectorally, I think we could turn the crisis into opportunities with massive investments and productivity improvements. In terms of finance, we need to create integrated capital markets. We need to work on deepening the financial relationship. It can't just be official direct investment. It can't just be FDI in construction and mining. It should also be into the manufacturing sector. It should move away from simple treasury bills and then portfolio management. So a much more integrated financial agenda, which is none of the agreements right now, right? Immigration and labor, a completely new approach to immigration. We need to create a framework of incentives to link the immigrants back to their own countries, not send them back, but allow them to create. So we don't, when somebody leaves Morocco, they can't leave completely. They have to, like, we need to make sure that the exit, the brain drain is not hurting Morocco itself. Something as basic as multiple visas. So the guy leaves and come back anytime he wants. like this. The ability to move across borders is something which is quite important as well. Don't ignore the social angle. Right? The social angle is often ignored in the relationship. To foster trade liberalization while reducing trade liberalization creates pain. There's winners and there are losers. This is a crucial concept, right? So we need to focus on the losers and to help them. And that, by the way, requires, and this is my last technocratic point, is massive transitional and convergence funding. There should be recognition that integration is costly and there's a lot of people who are going to be losing, and typically the ones who lose are the poor, the uneducated. So deal, and we know from the point I made before that matters to the Arabs, right? So convergence and transitional funding of the magnitude and of the kind that Europe offers to East Europe should be part of the technocratic solution and the reimagination of the relationship, right? This that, and this, I'm almost done here. There's also the meta political angle, right? A top-down European normative effort towards reform in the region is not just suspect and impractical, which is the way it's been doing right now. It also lacks a local buy-in, right? And if we learned anything from the Arab Spring, we realized that kind of top-down, technocratic, don't deal with the social, don't deal with the losers, only deal with the governments, is highly problematic and is not going to allow the people, will not allow the people to buy into the effort, right? So you need a more developmental, co-developmental model, right? Here, one point that many authors mention when they write about this region is that a positive feedback loop is needed. Right? You need to start helping certain segments of the society, create winners, and then as a result, move on, right? So the conclusion here, and this is where I'm going to stop, is that the ultimate objective is simply to change completely the relationship between the Arab world and Europe, away from simply looking for cheap labor and lower skills and focusing on the self-interest of Europeans towards more of a profound development project that not only will increase production and exports, but ultimately leads to the ultimate thing that we're all after, which is convergence, economic convergence of the kind we both, on both sides of the Mediterranean, are looking for. So what are the points I tried to make here? I tried to sort of make the point that the effort has been at best disappointing, at worst a failure. It cannot be divorced from the fact that the development model in the Arab world itself is independent of the European relationship, has had major issues. However, the design of the integration ever since the Barcelona Agreement has a lot of faults and requires rethinking. This is partly political in nature and reflects the way Europe has approached the region. This cannot be divorced from a geopolitical, very complicated geopolitical context that has made that integration effort that much higher as a result of the emergence of new challenges. And as a result, a new imagination, a new renegotiation of the redesign of the project is completely needed. Partly technical in nature, there's a lot of things that we can do technically, but also requires a completely different political mindset, if you will. So Cheryl, I'm going to stop here. I don't know how long I spoke for like 40 minutes, I think. I hope I didn't lose you or bore you guys all. So let me stop and see if there's any comments or questions.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. I think we have questions in the chat and also the Q&A, and there's also one attendee who would like to speak. So whoever you would like to answer first.
You know what? Should I read them or?
Sure, yes. Okay. So the first question is, how would you say Turkey differed from Arab countries in terms of integration with EU members?
Well, I mean, Turkey is a fascinating example, right? You would not, I would not argue by any stretch of the imagination that the former relationship between Europe and Turkey is any better. If anything, the association agreements that Europe has signed with certainly North Africa are deeper than the ones that they've signed with Europe. The mistrust between Europe and Turkey is probably even bigger than the mistrust between Turkey and the Arab world. Having said that, Turkey punched above at its weight in a way that the Arab world has not. And this is a very much a reflection. By the way, this is all until the last few years. Unfortunately, Turkey is taking a complete different detour right now. But from Ozal in 81 into, I'm going to say, as early as 5 years ago or 6 years ago, Europe, Turkey charted a very different economic development model, right? One of the examples I always give is that it's fascinating. In 1975, Egypt exported twice what Turkey did. Today, Turkey is, and don't quote me on this number because I don't remember it, has 10 times what Egypt exports. So it's a matter. Turkey grows on average. The trend growth in Turkey is 5-6%. In the Arab world, it's closer to 1%. It's a very different economic model. One that was much competitiveness in Turkey, or like they never allowed the currency to become massively overvalued. As a result, they always had ability to export quite significantly. They tended to be pro-business, and they have a private sector that is thriving with families that are large, producing, with international presence, right? So I think that the big difference between Turkey and the Arab world is not about the relationship between the South and the North, and more about how they dealt with their economy itself. The sad thing is that Turkey today is increasingly looking more and more like the Arab world, as opposed to the Arab world looking like Turkey. They're shifting the wrong direction. But from the Ozal change till late Erdogan period, I think they had so here I'm focusing much more on the economic, on the domestic factors that allowed them to chart a different route, that allowed them to integrate globally significantly more than the Arab world ever did.
I'm going to give, okay, so I think you can unmute yourself now.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation, Amer. Here's also Amer as well. I have some questions regarding your presentation. And first of all, I am missing the positive aspect of the integration between, or trying to have an integration between the EU or Europe and the Arab world. Because from what I get, that all these efforts to integrate have been a failure. But then we are seeing this as in, I had the impression that the two counterparts of this integration are being as an equal partners. But then what I'm trying to say is that Europe has a different starting point. So, for example, if we go back to the Marshall Plan in 1948, where Europe started from below zero, it has been supported by the US, and then through all its integration process, Coal and Steel Committee, and yada, yada, yada. And then also Europe tried to do enlargement policies plus neighborhood policies. And this is from one side. On the other hand, the Arab world, we don't even have in the Arab world any kind of trade agreements besides the GCC agreements. So, and for Europe to foster the way it fostered, it needed to raise these barriers that we were talking about. So my question is, how could we talk about a kind of integration if we don't have the same starting points?
No, yeah, Amr, I think you're making the same point I'm making, which is that like all these factors that I try to capture are the ones that are making the two regions very imbalanced in the way that like there's a huge imbalance, right? Between the two regions. So Europe never treated the region as an equal. The region itself punched well below its weight as a result of that, and that imbalance between the two, where they had a more of a different, wrong approach of dealing with us at the time when we ourselves were not helping each other, helping ourselves, and helping ourselves is both domestically, as in the development model intra-country, like every country in the Arab world failed, but also inter-regionally. I made the point about Happenspoke, is that you cannot deal with a giant like Europe separate. You have to deal with them as a centralized hub, right? And we failed in that. So we failed both in terms of developing our own growth model and the regional growth model at a time when they themselves were thinking of us always as what does it mean for us? It's never been about what it means for the Arab world. So again, I would like the point I want to leave you with, if I want to leave one point here, is that if the ultimate objective for historical reasons is integration, we need to redesign and rethink about this project from scratch. And this requires a more comprehensive change, both from the way the Europe approaches the Arab world and how the Arab world itself approaches itself.
Exactly, to get the house in order first.
I mean, that's the crucial point. That's the crucial point. I mean, I don't want to just blame the Arabs. I think the blame goes both ways.
I hope this answered your question, Amer. Also, we have another question in the chat. Do you think that Europe's Eastern Partnership could be a starting point for integration as a model, or is this still more of the same model?
No, I think this is exactly the model we need to follow. That's exactly the model. There's another model which is not unsimilar, which is NAFTA in Europe. That is between the US and Mexico. The point, like, this is the 8 things that I mentioned. We need not just trade liberalization. It has to be a more structural transformation between the two. We need to focus on education. We need to focus on quality control and raising productivity. We need to focus on the social side of the equations, because they're going to be losers. Europe needs to give money because transition is painful. So how do we ease the transition? You have to approach it politically different, as equals, as partners. The objective ultimately, I mean, in Europe, the ultimate objective of East European was bringing them into the fold and making them membership. Membership has never been really. It was a stick. There was an apple that was shown, but never really taken seriously. I mean, in Turkey, it was the closest, and nobody really took it seriously that Turkey could ever join the Middle East, join Europe. The point I'm making is that the East European model is if we're really serious about integration, if we really want the South to become our partner, we need to be thinking about it more profoundly, in the way Europe thinks about East Europe, in the way the US thinks of Mexico and North America. That's the depth that is needed.
I do have a question. How do you say the economic power dynamic between the EU and the MENA region is going to change after the Russian invasion in Ukraine? Now that Europe might be looking for an alternative source for its, it reinitiated the Vienna negotiations to import gas from Iran, for example. How do you think that will change the power dynamic economically between the regions?
I've been thinking a lot about it for Lebanon, by the way, Sharel, as well. I mean, I think, like, listen, I struggle with like, who knows, right? This is a local, but I think there is a paradigm shift that is developing right now, and the paradigm shift is happening at 3 levels. It's happening at the level of the West, particularly the US. With all due respect to my European friends, the US is the one that matters more. The US rediscovered the Middle East, right? We spent the last 20 years with an explicit and implicit pivot away from the Middle East towards Asia. The Asia pivot became the definition of how the US geopolitical raison d'etre, as it were, right? And I think and as a result, the US started slowly disengaging from the Middle East, but also disengaging from Europe, right? And the Russian invasion clearly showed that disengagement is unsustainable, and that Europe still matters, the Middle East still matters to the US, right? So I think that re-engagement with Europe and the Middle East is a game changer, right? It's going back and saying Asia is important, but Europe and the Middle East is just as important. 2, the resuscitation of the Western alliance, the speed with which the West sort of came together so aggressively, really brought back the West in a way that we haven't had really since arguably 2003, the Saddam's invasion of right. We've been this drift that I was talking about, transatlantic drift that I was talking about, seems to be amended and healed, right? And the third is your point about is natural resources and the importance of particularly energy. And energy is not just fossil fuel, right? I mean, remember that sun, heat, right? This is a huge huge skill that we have, not skill, asset that we have in the Middle East right now. Right? So we should be, in theory, we should be able to now. How does it play out? Is it could go both ways, right? In the romantic in me, the idealist in me, likes to think that this is the beginning of a new moment of liberal order, of the Western liberal order re-emerging, that is more constructive, like the kind of thing that you guys are young, but in the early 90s, when we really thought, and that's when the Barcelona agreement itself was negotiated. There was this moment of globalization, of multilateral engagement, led by the West, that at that point was emerging as a victor, the unipolar moment. So you could imagine that becoming the model. And if that's the case, then I think that is going to help the private sector in the Middle East, the young. I think that's the idealistic in me. The pragmatist in me, unfortunately, sees that as more of a commercial relationship that is very temporary. That we need them for the next 10 minutes because they have the oil, but we're not going to deepen it further. So you could see how this could end up being a positive game changer, but I'm not convinced. Time will tell.
But wouldn't you say then that would also depend on the attitude of the Middle East or the MENA region towards these negotiations?
Of course, and unfortunately, I mean, again, dealing with the regimes themselves is not the answer. The regimes themselves are going to try to resuscitate a commercial, self-interested relationship that benefits their interests and stops the reform, stops them. So they're going to use the West as the ATM, use the not just financially but also politically to preserve their power and strengthen it. That's what they're going to try to do. Right? And they're going to try to be intelligent. Like this is how you see the Israel, the Abraham Accords. Right? You could see it as the regime strengthening their own internal by creating alliances internally with strong military powers, Israel in this case. This is not a profound positive shift, right? On the other hand, if you see the Arab Spring re-emerging, and yes, today's elections in Lebanon is interesting, right? We got one fifth of the parliament are people who are completely outside the establishment. So if we start seeing more of a street level, ground level, liberal emergence of the youth, of the middle class, of the educated, and we can force the transformation onto the regimes to say, fine, the world is better now because the West is re-energized and reunified. We need to have a relationship with them, not intermediated through the regimes. Then we could get into a better place. I'm not very optimistic.
Well, let's hope. If no one else in the attendees have any other questions, I think.
I also have to, unfortunately, I have to go to a meeting.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry we kept you like 6 minutes overtime. But this was a very interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you so much for making the time for this. And yes, thank you so much. And it was a really nice ending for the Euro-Arab Conversation lecture series, and hoping for more in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
Good luck to everybody. Bye-bye.